Hello, my name is Ariella Elema. I'm a historian of medieval law who specializes in the history of trial by combat. Today I'm going to talk to you about the case of Jean de Carrouges versus Jacques le Gris, a lawsuit that occurred in Paris in 1386. It's the subject of the book The Last Duel by Eric Jaeger, and also of the upcoming movie The Last Duel, directed by Ridley Scott. Just so you know, what I'm actually going to do today is spoil the movie for you, because I'm going to talk about the judicial duel that ended the lawsuit. We're also going to be discussing a prosecution for rape and some fairly graphic violence. To give you some background on this case, Jean de Carrouges was a knight from Normandy who made much of his money as a soldier, joining the military expeditions far from home. We don't know his exact birth date, but in 1386 he was probably approaching 60 years old. His wife Marguerite was his second wife, and she was much younger than him, probably in her 20s. He also had an on-again, off-again friend with whom he sometimes quarreled, named Jacques le Gris. All of them had the same lord, Count Pierre d'Alençon, the Count of Perche, and le Gris was a squire in the Count's service. One day in 1386, Carrouges was out of town, and his mother had taken most of the family servants out on a day trip, leaving Marguerite nearly alone in the family castle. Allegedly, Jacques le Gris chose that moment to pay a visit. What happened next is unclear. There is conflicting testimony, but when Carrouges got back, Marguerite told him that le Gris had raped her, and that became the core of a criminal trial. Now, at this point in late medieval history, the Kingdom of France was still in the process of developing a state and a justice system that would go out and prosecute criminals on its own initiative. Count Pierre d'Alençon, Carrouges and le Gris' lord, did attempt to hold an inquiry and call some witnesses who knew things about the incident. But Jean and Marguerite de Carrouges refused to come and testify. Instead, they went to the court of the king, the Parliament of Paris, and launched a criminal lawsuit themselves. Medieval legal jurisdictions were kind of flexible that way. The trial process they made use of was an older one known as an appeal. Under those rules, the victim, or their next of kin in the case of a murder, had to bring the case to court themselves and organize the prosecution themselves. In this case, it was further complicated by the fact that Marguerite, as a married woman, could not by law launch a lawsuit all by herself. It had to be done by her husband, who was not an eyewitness. The word appeal, appel in French, came from the verb appeler, to call. The victim had to quite literally call out the wrongdoer. The process was not just for appeals in the modern sense of a suit meant to reverse a previous court's decision. Any criminal prosecution could start that way. The rules of evidence in a medieval appeal were rudimentary, and in this case nobody really knew what had happened except Marguerite herself and Jacques le Gris. Often a case of this sort concluded with the accused finding a certain number of respectable men to swear an oath about his good character and reputation, and that was it. But what if the crime was a very serious one, and the accuser didn't want to accept an oath? One of the few options open to him was to have a trial by combat. The trial by combat was a lawsuit where the outcome of the case was quite literally decided by the accuser and the accused having a duel. The winner of the duel won the case, and the loser was either guilty of the crime if they were the accused, or guilty of perjury for bringing a false accusation if they were the accuser. In theory, a judicial duel was supposed to be an appeal to God, and God was supposed to manipulate the duel to ensure that the just party won. Sometimes it seemed like people just said, God only knows what happened. But if we let this dispute fester, it will draw in more and more people and lead to violence and destroy our community. So let's just let the principal parties fight it out. In practice, hardly any challenges to trial by combat led to a duel. If the rights and wrongs of the case were not completely clear, it was possible to resolve even serious criminal accusations out of court, with apologies, accords, possibly compensation, kind of like civil litigation today. And like today's civil litigation, or like the way a strike works in modern labor law, the point was to try to negotiate right up to the deadline. If a case actually ended in a big showdown, it meant that someone had made a miscalculation and underestimated the opposition. In the case of Carrouges and Gris, nobles' reputations were on the line. They had the king involved now, and nobody wanted to blink. So, the duel happened. This was an unusual judicial duel because we have multiple blow-by-blow accounts of what went down at the fight itself. Normally, if we have historical records of a trial by combat, they're trial records and they don't tell us about the fighting, only who won. In this case, because the duel was late in the Middle Ages when more people were writing books, and it was so high profile, 5 different people tell us what they saw or heard about it. 2 of those sources were probably eyewitnesses. The chronicler known as the Monk of Saint-Denis was the official historian of King Charles VI, the King of France at the time. This cleric came from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just outside the walls of Paris, and he was often at the royal court. His chronicle is just about contemporary with this duel, and it describes it in great detail, so there's a good chance he saw it in person. If not, he was definitely able to interview other courtiers who did. There's another description of the duel in the notebook of Jean Lecoq, Jacques Legris's own lawyer. He seemed troubled by the case, and he went over all the reasons why his client's behavior at the duel may or may not have indicated that he was guilty. Lecoq was definitely there in person. A third chronicler, who has a detailed description of the fight, is Jean Froissart. He was not present. In 1386, he was living in the Netherlands, but he traveled through France soon afterward and wrote the part of his chronicle that includes the Carrouges and Gris case within 4 years after it happened. You can think of him as the guy who recorded everybody's hot take on the affair. There are 2 other chronicles, the account of Jean Juvenal des Ursins and the Chronographia Regum Francorum. They have shorter accounts of the case. They were written locally in Paris within living memory of the duel, but several decades after it occurred. They record the way people talked about it a generation later. From these 5 accounts, we can sort of piece together what happened. 3 of the chronicles tell us that the place for the duel was set up in a city square within the walls of Paris. It would have been a rectangular enclosure surrounded by post and rail fences. A structure like this was known as a set of lists. There would have been a raised viewing stand on one side for the most important members of the audience, and some chairs, or even possibly pavilions, for Carrouges and Gris at either end. Legris's lawyer, Jean Lecoq, tells us that these lists were modeled after some other lists in Gisors, Normandy, which might not have been the best prototype, because those ones were built for men fighting on foot and not just for jousting on horseback. A fight on foot needs a lot less space. You can have one in your living room if you don't mind trashing the place. But horses need more room to gallop and turn around, especially if there are lances involved. And this may explain what happened next. Here's where I spoil the plot for you. The sources agree that at some point at the beginning of the fight, Carrouges and Gris were mounted on horseback. First, there would have been a proclamation calling on the audience to remain absolutely silent, and then the reason for the duel would have been announced, and the 2 men would have had to swear oaths that they were each telling the truth and the other guy was perjuring himself. They would also have had to swear that they didn't have any magic amulets on them. Magic stones and bones and jewels and bits of parchment with prayers on them could subvert the very will of God, apparently. Now at this point, Froissart says the 2 of them jousted 1 pass, but didn't score any hits. But remember, he wasn't there. Eric Jaeger, in the book The Last Duel, has a long dramatic passage about a very big joust with many passes where they smashed each other and bent each other backwards over their horses' hindquarters. This is actually taken from Froissart's account of a completely different event, a jousting tournament at Saint-Engelvert in 1390. It's not what happened at this fight. Next, there's a whole story in the Last Duel about an axe battle on horseback. That one's completely apocryphal. None of the medieval narratives mention it. What the monk of Saint Denis, a probable eyewitness, says is that as soon as the signal was given for the fight to begin, the two men abandoned their horses. He uses an odd Latin word, a bigeront. They drove off the horses, which could mean they spurred them forward. But Lecoq, the lawyer, says that his client could have attacked Carrouges on horseback, but he did it on foot instead. So I'm inclined to think they just dismounted. Remember, Lecoq mentioned that the lists were not really suitable for horses. At any rate, what happened next, according to the monk of Saint Denis, is that in the very first attack, Gris stabbed Carrouges in the thigh with a sword. You have to remember that both of these men are wearing complete suits of late 14th century armor. By this point in time, French armor had plates that covered the whole leg when you were sitting on a horse, and the saddle had a large saddle bow in front that protected the crotch. It would have been pretty hard to stab someone in the thigh if he was mounted up like that, but if he was on foot, there were armor joints that would make it a viable target. So, blood started flowing out of the wound. I'm sure it created a problem for Jean de Carrouges, but it also created a quandary for the king who was judging the duel. By the second half of the 14th century, judicial duels in Europe were often treated like high-stakes tournaments. The lord who was acting as judge allowed the two parties to joust a few passages or strike a small number of blows, and then he called a halt, praised both men, they were almost always men, for having the guts to show up and risk their lives, and then he imposed his own settlement on the case. That way, both men walked away with their honor and their limbs intact. But Jacques Gris wrecked this whole plan when he wounded Carrouges right away on the first attack. Now the king couldn't stop the fight without looking like he was interfering with the will of God, so he let it continue. Nowadays, there is actually quite a lot of research about how knights in armor would have fought a duel. Starting about 25 years after this combat, people in various parts of Europe began producing illustrated manuals of fighting techniques. There's now a fairly large international community of martial artists with good reproductions of medieval and Renaissance armor who like to practice their interpretations of this technique on each other, to the extent that they can do that without breaking each other, and we can learn things from them. Armored combat doesn't look like fencing, it's more like wrestling with can openers. And that's what we hear from the monk of Saint Denis. He says that at this point Jean de Carrouges, quote, marshalling his soul into his strength, stepped in closer and exclaimed, "Our quarrel is judged this day." With his left hand, he seized the peak of Jacques' helmet and drew the man to himself. Stepping back a little, he threw him to the ground alone, prostrate and weighed down by his armor, unquote. i.e., he threw him by his head. We know from the martial artists that the weight of armor alone doesn't prevent you from getting up if you fall down, and it wouldn't have prevented a man like Jacques Gris from doing so. Therefore, there's a good chance that the throw gave Gris a neck injury or a concussion. There's a manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France that has a picture of Carrouges and Gris wrestling on the ground with daggers, and Carrouges lifting Gris' visor and stabbing him right in the face. That's the way the fight ends in the book The Last Duel, and probably the way it ends in the upcoming movie. But this manuscript miniature is from a much later chronicle. It's based on Froissart's account, and you can see his claim about the jousting there too, and poor Marguerite watching the duel from her wagon. But dagger stabbing is not how Froissart, or any of the other four sources who were roughly contemporary with the duel, say the fight ended. In fact, it's not even how the text of this picture's chronicle says it ended. All the chroniclers who describe the finish, that is, the monk, Froissart, and Juvenal des Ursins, agree that Carrouges was standing, Gris was lying on the ground, and Carrouges stabbed Gris with a sword. So if someone is wearing armor from 1386 and lying face down, it's actually pretty hard to stab them fatally. The armor covers all their vital spots. They're wearing a quilted coat called a gambesson, and over that a haubergeon of chainmail, and by this period a good harness probably has on top of that a coat of plates that wraps all the way around their back. Their aventail, the curtain of mail that hangs from the helm, protects their neck. To get under it, you'll have to shift it aside, which means you'll likely have to bend down and put yourself in some danger of getting pulled into a wrestling match on the ground. 6 years before this duel, there was another duel in London where a knight named John Annesley tried to throw himself on top of his opponent, but he was blinded by sweat in his helmet and visor and he missed, so he fell on the ground next to him. The two of them struggled and flopped around so long that the judge eventually broke it up, and the opponent died the next day of what was probably heat exhaustion or internal injuries. So Jean de Carrouges had a good reason not to want to get down on the ground with a dagger. If he spitted Jacques Le Gris with a sword, as all the chroniclers claim, and Le Gris was wearing armor suitable for horseback riding, what was the obvious target? Yeah, the seat of his pants. Kind of ironic for a rape trial. The monk says Carrouges, quote, threw Le Gris down and commanded him many times to admit the truth, and also that he, quote, killed his enemy with great difficulty because he was encased in armor. I'm getting the sense that this was not a swift or a graceful stabbing. The chroniclers may be sparing us some graphic details. But then there's the artist who made this manuscript miniature on the right. It comes from Paris around 1410, and it's supposed to portray some kings from classical antiquity, but they're standing in some fenced lists, and I kind of think this artist is referencing an incident that everyone in Paris knew about. He's happy to show you exactly what it looked like. So, Carrouges won the duel, and Le Gris died, and then the executioner dragged his corpse to the gibbet and hanged him for good measure. So there were 5 accounts of this judicial duel written by people who were in a position to know what happened. They still don't tell us all the details, but they largely agree. There may or may not have been some jousting, but it was over quickly. There was no epic battle where they smashed each other backwards out of the saddle and killed each other's horses. Nothing about an axe fight. What they do say is that Le Gris stabbed Carrouges in the thigh, and then Carrouges threw him on the ground and stabbed him with a sword. My theory is that we, the readers, are supposed to take the hint about where and how he stabbed him, because the chroniclers assume that we can visualize the mechanics of armored combat, and they think we know what the armor of their time looked like. There's a bit of irony here. This video and the book The Last Duel, and the movie The Last Duel, are giving you 3 different interpretations of the same source material. And the sources that describe the duel are giving you 5 different interpretations of the same event. And the event happened because a court and a king didn't want to have to evaluate 2 people's conflicting interpretations about an incident that they were both involved in. But not all the versions of the story are equal. It's up to us to develop the tools to analyze the evidence and reach a judgment.